My name is Elena Marsh. I served 22 years in digital operations deployed to places I can't name. Worked missions I'll never be able to explain. I read heat signatures on maps like second language. I cracked encrypted comms at 3 a.m. with one eye open. I spent most of my adult life in windowless rooms, making sure threats never touched American soil. But none of that meant anything on the afternoon I stood outside my grandfather's house, the one with the green porch swing and cracked cement steps, and got treated like I didn't exist. It was early October, still warm enough for the sidewalk to breathe heat. I had just stepped out of a taxi uniform, still crisp discharge papers folded in my backpack. I looked up at the porch light above me. It used to blink twice, then go solid. Grandpa rigged it that way so Grandma would know when it was him coming home. That light still blinked. But this time, it wasn't for me. I rang the bell and waited. There was no sound but a dog barking somewhere down the street. I heard the old intercom click on the kind that buzzed a little before someone spoke. "You need to leave," Sophie's voice said, flat, like an automated message. "Sophie," I answered, unsure if I should smile, wave, or stand at attention. "It's me." A long pause. Then, "You don't live here anymore." No hello. No, "You're back." No acknowledgement of the fact I hadn't seen her since Mum's funeral. Just a sentence that felt like a border wall. "I just got back," I said. "I wanted to see the house. This isn't your house." Her voice didn't shake. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not here to take anything I said, and even I wasn't sure if that was true. The door stayed shut. A shadow moved behind the window. A man's shoulder. Broad. "Connor, if you don't leave," Sophie added, "I'm calling the police." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Seriously, you left Elena," she said. "You disappeared. I was deployed. That's not my fault." Then, silence. For a second, I thought maybe she walked away. But then I saw her hand lift the curtain and her phone in the other screen glowing. I didn't move, not out of defiance, just because I didn't know where to go. 10 minutes later, the cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, one young one older. The younger one had his hand near his belt. The older had that familiar gait, military. He scanned my uniform. Recognition flickered in his face, but only for a second. "Eleanor Marsh," he asked. "Yes, sir." "We got a call about a trespasser." I nodded. "I'm not here to cause trouble. This was my grandfather's home." The younger one checked his tablet. "Property title says Sophie Marsh and Connor Hale." "Do you have any documentation that disputes that?" I hesitated. "No, not on me." "Then I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I looked past them toward the house. The porch light had gone out. The windows were dark, like no one had ever lived there. "Understood," I said. I turned and walked to the car. Not mine, a rental, parked 2 blocks down under a streetlight that buzzed like a tired insect. I sat in the driver's seat coat, zipped to my chin. I didn't cry. I hadn't in years. Not when we lost people. Not when I got the notice about my clearance being downgraded. Not even when I emptied my apartment and found nothing worth boxing. But something in that porch, the way Sophie said my name like it tasted bad, the way Connor didn't even look up something in that cracked. I sat there for hours. At one point I opened the glove box and stared at the envelope with my DD-214. It was still warm from the manila folder I'd carried it in all day. Like it mattered, like it proved anything. Around midnight, a single light turned on inside the house. A silhouette crossed the living room. Tall, stiff, my father. Same posture he had in every boardroom photo I ever saw online. He didn't look outside, didn't flinch, just kept walking like ghosts didn't bother him. I opened my phone. No texts, except one. No contact, no name, just a sentence. "Don't come back. It's not yours anymore." I let the phone drop into the cup holder and stared at the windshield until my breath fogged the glass. At 2:00 a.m, I leaned back in the seat, closed my eyes and told myself the same thing I did overseas when things went dark and cold. Stay quiet. Stay ready. Wait for the next signal. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next signal didn't come with fanfare. No sudden flash of truth or dramatic confession. Just the steady hum of streetlights and the silence of a town that had already closed its doors for the night. I stayed in that car like it was the last outpost of something familiar. The seat creaked when I shifted. The overhead light flickered once when I adjusted the rearview mirror. I saw the house behind me, in its small, distant indifference. I hadn't planned for this. I hadn't booked a hotel or called anyone. Some part of me had believed naively that family might still mean something, that someone would leave the porch light on and say, "You're home." Instead, I was parked 2 blocks away, angled between a fire hydrant and a trash bin, my duffel bag still in the trunk. The uniform I wore was neat, but stiff like it no longer belonged to anyone. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. That wasn't how I processed things. I sat there, eyes open, watching the night swallow the street inch by inch. Across from me, an old oak tree bent just slightly under the weight of its own history. I used to climb that tree with Sophie. We carved our initials into the bark once EM&SM 1997. I wonder if it's still there. Probably not. Or maybe someone covered it with paint, like they did with everything else they didn't want to see. At 3:17 a.m, my phone buzzed, the screen lit up with a single message. No contact name. Just don't come back. It's not yours anymore. I stared at it. My first instinct wasn't fear, it was recognition. I knew that kind of message. Clean, direct, cowardly. A message meant to erase without confrontation. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. The house loomed in the distance. From here, the windows looked like empty sockets. No movement inside, just stillness. I spotted something near the edge of the yard, slightly crooked. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. A sign barely visible in the dark. For sale, private listing. The stake holding it was tilted as if someone had jammed it into the ground without much care. It hadn't been there last time I came through town, so they were trying to sell it. Quietly, without drawing attention, without involving me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. Not to cry, just to breathe. The leather was cold, a reminder that the car wasn't mine. Nothing here was. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a pack of breath mints I'd shoved there during the drive. I popped one into my mouth, letting the sharp mint sting my tongue. It kept me awake. I thought about turning on the radio, but even static felt too loud. I didn't want company. I didn't want comfort. I wanted to sit in this moment and feel every inch of it, because I knew what was coming. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was erasure. Carefully orchestrated, legally manoeuvred, quietly executed, like I never existed. At 4:02 a.m, I noticed the porch light blink on for a second, then go off again. No one came out. No one peered through the blinds. It was just a glitch. Or maybe muscle memory. Maybe Connor accidentally flipped the switch on his way to the kitchen. I imagined the layout hadn't changed. The kitchen would still have that squeaky drawer to the left of the sink, the one where Grandma used to hide her emergency money. I closed my eyes and saw her hands worn and speckled pressing quarters into my palm with a wink. Don't tell your sister. My chest tightened, not from grief exactly, more like detachment. A sharp awareness that these people I had fought for, worried about protected by proxy from 1,000 miles away, had decided I no longer qualified as one of them. I was tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. More like the slow unravelling of a flag left out in the wind too long. faded, frayed, still standing. By sunrise, I could see my breath in the air. The windows of the house glowed faint orange as the morning crept in. I saw a figure move through the living room. Victor Marsh, my father, still upright, still walking like he owned the air around him. He passed the window, paused, then turned away. He never looked toward the street. I waited anyway, just in case, but no one opened the door. No one stepped out to ask why their daughter, their sister, their blood was parked down the road like an unwelcome guest. I watched the light shift from amber to white the way houses do when day takes over. The sign on the lawn stayed crooked. I took one last look at the house, then at myself in the mirror. Same eyes, same sharp lines from the academy, same woman who used to think loyalty was a form of currency. I started the engine, not to drive away, just to warm up the silence. I drove to Maxine's, the cafe where Mara and I used to meet during law school. She always ordered black coffee, no sugar, and her expression stayed steady even when the world scrambled around us. I pulled into a spot in front and shut the engine off. It was early afternoon, but the place smelled like yesterday-old wood-stale pastries, the buzz of half-forgotten conversations. Mara stood at the counter, waiting, her shoulders squared, hair pulled back tight. She wore a navy blazer that looked more suited to a courthouse than a coffee shop. I pushed open the door, stepped in, and she looked up. For a second, I thought she softened, but then she offered a curt nod. "I'm here," I said. "Good," she replied. "Sit." She slid a white envelope across the table. I opened it. Inside was a full property transfer record, documented, signed, filed, but not under Marsh Family or Marsh & Marsh LLC. It said, Hallicor Properties, Hallicor Properties, I repeated voice level. "That's Connor's logistics company." She raised an eyebrow. "And your sister's husband is listed as a principal. Your father is listed as a silent partner." She tapped the page. "Your name is there too. But the signature isn't you." The words hit cold. Seeing my name next to theirs on paper, but not being me. I looked at the signature proof. A cropped image of my name, the letters too smooth, too together, like someone traced over the top. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. When I opened them, Mara had pulled another folder toward me. The notary on the transfer, she said, lost his license 6 months before signing, under investigation for falsifying public records. She showed me a printout the state bar had revoked him. She'd circled the date 3 months ago. I stared at it. 3 months ago, during my final deployment at Ramstein, I was halfway across the world. He was signing documents here, documents I didn't know existed. Why didn't I know? I whispered. "Because they didn't want you to," Mara said quietly. "They structured it through shell companies. They erased your name, then gave it back on paper, just enough to claim legitimacy, but not enough that the courts would flag it without comparison." I swallowed hard. My own father and sister. She nodded. "That's what the documents say?" She paused, then slid across a photo print. It was a scanned image of the Hallicor filing, with Victor Marsh's name in faint type under owner. Sophie's was in clear, bold type. Mine was a photocopy that looked pasted on. I burned from the inside. I wanted to slam the table screen at them, but I didn't. I folded my hands where they lay, and I said, "Tell me exactly what they did." Mara leaned forward. "They created Hallicor just for this. They transferred the title from your grandfather's name to Halcor. They submitted a notarized affidavit with your name, and the notary had no authority. Then they recorded it. Now legally, it's out of your grandfather's name. It's in Halcor's name." She tapped each word as if staking them into the table, which your father and Connor control. "So they erased me." My voice was low, almost a confession. "And then they made me not you, the heir of my own house." I said it like a mantra. "I'm the heir of my own house." It tasted like ash. Mara closed the folder and reached into her briefcase. She pulled out a printed checklist. This is step 1. We need proof that the signature isn't yours, that the notary was unlicensed. Then we follow the chain bank accounts emails any transfer of funds. We build a case for fraud and forgery. I leaned back staring at the ceiling. The cafe chatter felt distant. I touched the name tag pinned to my shirt, Eleanor Marsh, Lieutenant, U.S. Army, Ret. I felt the weight of it again. My name, my service. I want one thing, I said slowly. I want them to say my name again. To mean something. To open the house and know exactly who I am. Mara reached across and tapped the name tag. Then, this is the plan. We start here. I slid the documents into my bag. I didn't look at them again. I didn't need to. The words floated inside me. Halicore properties, forged signature, erased inheritance. That's all I asked, for now, Mara said. She picked up her coffee and tilted the cup. We're just beginning. I nodded and stared at the window. My reflection overlapped with the empty street. I thought about what would come next, investigating electricity usage, finding witnesses, gathering digital evidence. I thought about the quiet nights alone, about the letters in the glove box, about a woman who once believed family was everything. Then I stood up with that same quiet resolve I held in the car. No tears, no anger, just clarity. I won't disappear again. The words stayed with me as I drove through the neighbourhood, past the old elementary school, the ball field with rusted bleachers, the library where Grandma volunteered every Saturday. The town hadn't changed much, but something about it felt blurred, like someone had drawn over the familiar lines with water and let it bleed out. I didn't go back to the house. Not yet. Instead, I turned toward the edge of town where the road dipped and the air smelled like soil and pine. The cemetery gate was still crooked from that last big storm. I parked outside and walked the gravel path past headstones weathered with moss and memory. I found her plot near the back. Margaret Marsh, beloved wife, mother, 1955-2009. There were no flowers, just a cracked ceramic angel someone must have left years ago. I knelt and rested a palm on the cold stone. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Her silence was something I had grown up with. It used to frustrate me how she never raised her voice even when Dad pushed her opinions to the edge of the table. But now I understood it better. Her quiet was never surrender. It was a kind of survival, a way of making space for herself without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. I sat back and let the wind pass through my coat. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, I said, "I'm still here." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. Just like when I was 17 and she found me crying in the garage after Dad told me ROTC was a waste of time. She didn't tell me he was wrong. She just handed me a thermos of tea and said, "They won't see you coming, but you'll come." She was right. I did. I always did. I stayed there for a while, let the silence do its work. Then I stood and brushed off my knees. On the way back to the car, a memory slipped in one I hadn't thought of in years. I was 22, just commissioned, still uncertain in my dress blues. Grandpa had brought me to the side yard where the lemon tree used to bloom and handed me a folded letter. "If anything happens to me," he said, "this proves the house is yours." I remember the paper smelled faintly of ink and cedar. I read it once. It was simple. A statement of intent. Signed, dated with his full name at the bottom, Eugene Marsh. It wasn't a formal will, but it was his words, his choice. I tucked it into my journal, the one I kept on my first deployment. I never showed it to anyone. I never thought I'd need to. But now I wasn't sure where it had gone. I checked the journal months ago. It wasn't there. Maybe it got lost during one of the moves. Maybe someone found it. Or maybe it was still buried in a box somewhere. But It existed. I wasn't imagining it. I saw his signature. I heard his voice. "You're the only one who understands the bones of this place," he'd said. "Sophie was always a guest. You were the one who stayed." The memory hit like a quiet gut punch. I stood beside the car, fingers curling into my coat pockets, and I thought about that sentence. How much meaning could live in something as small as a sentence? I pulled out my phone and opened a note. I typed everything I could remember from the letter, its structure, the exact wording, if I could recall it, even the tilt of his handwriting. I saved it and backed it up. Then I opened my email and sent a copy to Mara. Subject line, Grandpa's letter. Reconstructed. I didn't know if it would hold up, but it was a start, and right now I needed starts. I looked back at the cemetery once more. The breeze had settled. The sky was pale blue with no clouds in sight. I whispered, "You knew they'd come for it, didn't you?" And I swear if the wind had a voice, it would have sounded like hers. "Yes, that's why I told you first." I got back in the car and started the engine again. There was more to uncover, not just missing letters, but the whole truth buried beneath signatures and silence. Mara called me 2 days later, her voice tight. "You need to see something," she said. I met her in the county records office, tucked between 2 file cabinets with sticky drawers and a flickering light overhead. She laid out the utility reports like they were war maps. "This is the house," she said, pointing. "Monthly electricity usage. Look at the spike starting 4 weeks ago." I leaned in. The numbers tripled. "Someone's running something down there," she continued. "It's not normal seasonal variance. It's a basement level load. Air conditioning unit, commercial grade freezers, maybe something worse. And get this, no renovation permits, no contractor filings, no electrical upgrades. So it's off the books," I said. "Exactly." She crossed her arms. "We might be looking at illegal storage, data laundering, even supply chain fraud, depending on what's moving in and out." I remembered the for sale sign, the private listing, the urgency behind it. "Connor," I said. "He's logistics." She nodded. "And that's not just a guess. I talked to someone who works nights at the auto shop 2 blocks down. Carl Rivers." My breath caught a little. "Carl, my grandfather's friend," yet Mara said, "still runs diagnostics and inspections. Said he saw Connor unloading boxes into the side entrance after midnight. No labels, no shipping trucks, just his van and sometimes Sophie helping." I stared at the files. My name was still on some of the old utility forms. It didn't mean legal ownership, but it meant something. "What did he say about me?" I asked, not sure why I asked. Mara paused. Her mouth tightened. "He said, Sophie told people you're unwell, that you've had breakdowns, that being in the military did something to your head." My fingers curled into fists. "PTSD. That's what she's implying. Said you became paranoid. That's why they kept you out of the inheritance." "That's a lie," I said, not shouted, just stated. "I know," Mara said. "But it's what she's spreading." I felt like the floor shifted under me. All those years I held it together through classified briefings, through 3 a.m. drone feeds, through funerals with no bodies. And she used it, weaponized it. Not even directly, just enough to plant doubt. Enough to make me look like a risk. "They're building a version of you that they can erase," Mara said, "and they're using your service as the excuse." I looked down at the spreadsheets again. Numbers didn't lie. Usage this high had intent behind it. Connor wasn't running a side project, he was moving something big. "Do we have photos?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "Carl said he could try, but he doesn't want to get caught." I nodded. "Then I'll go." Mara looked up sharply. "Eleanor?" "It's my house," I said. "I'll go around back. I know the cameras. Grandpa and I installed them. They haven't been replaced. They're motion-activated low-res. I can avoid them." "You're not active duty anymore," she said. "You're not cleared to." "I don't need clearance," I said, standing. "I need truth." She didn't stop me, just handed me a burner phone and said, "Don't do anything stupid." That night, I parked 3 houses down and waited. Just after 11:45, Connor's van turned into the driveway. No headlights. Sophie got out, first opened the side gate. Connor backed the van in. I waited until they went inside. Then, I moved, quick low to the hedge line. The side yard still had the loose panel by the drainage pipe we used to sneak through it as kids. I slipped past, crouched behind the trash bins. The basement door was cracked open. Light spilled out cool blue industrial. I heard the low hum of machinery. Freezers, cooling units, maybe a data rack. I pulled out the burner and took 3 photos. Door, light, partial license plate. Then I slipped back the way I came. No alarms, no footsteps behind me. Just the quiet knowledge that they weren't just stealing a house. They were hiding something inside it. I sent the photos to Mara with one word: confirmed. I sat in my car afterward, breathing like I'd just run 10 miles. My heart pounding, not from fear, but fury. They weren't just cutting me out. They were using the space I once called home to build something false, something possibly criminal. And if they could make me look unstable, no one would believe me when I spoke. But I'd spent my life decoding patterns, seeing the truth in noise. They chose the wrong person to erase. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by the same boxes I hadn't unpacked since the ceremony. One of them held a smaller box, the kind Grandpa used to keep old receipts and screws in. At the very bottom, under a folded flag and a faded wrench, I found it a black USB drive with a masking tape on the side. Written in his sharp, steady handwriting, EM. Only use if necessary. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of it far heavier than its size. Then I plugged it into my laptop. There was only one file, house.havid.mp4. I clicked play. Grandpa's face appeared on the screen, lit by the desk lamp in his old study. His voice, aged but unmistakably firm, filled the room. If you're watching this, then something has gone wrong. Let it be known that the property at 721 Mayfield Lane is intended for my granddaughter, Eleanor Marsh. It's hers. Not because of bloodline alone, but because she's the only one I trust to carry on this family's name with decency and strength. I've filed everything properly. This is my final say. The video ended. No music, no edits, just truth clean and undeniable. I watched it again, this time noticing the date, 2 days before his death. Time stamped digitally embedded, legally viable. I backed it up immediately. Twice. Once onto a cold storage drive, once into an encrypted cloud folder Isaac had set up years ago for classified projects. Then I opened the second file I hadn't noticed earlier. Mom, your letter, your draft, Dr. Docs. Her voice hit me like a pulse from the past. Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm not there to say it myself. It was unfinished but clear in tone. She spoke of Grandpa's intentions, her regrets about staying silent, and her wish for me to never forget who I was, even if others did. She didn't mention Dad. She didn't have to. I transcribed the letter by hand into a military-issue logbook. The same one I used to jot coordinates and briefings in when deployed. It felt like anchoring her words into something real, something the years couldn't erase. I spent the rest of the night turning evidence into insurance. Burned the video to 3 DVDs, printed out a transcript and had it notarized at a 24-hour legal kiosk. Uploaded encrypted versions to separate servers. Packaged one set into a manila envelope labelled, "If I Go Silent." This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. Protocols I used overseas, now applied to the battlefield, called family. The next morning, I made the drive to a print shop in a town no one in my family had ever heard of. Paid in cash. No trace. I stood at the counter while a teenager printed labels and burned discs his earbuds, in oblivious to the magnitude of what he was duplicating. When he handed me the sealed packet, I nodded once and said, Thanks for treating it like any other job. He didn't answer, just shrugged. Probably better that way. Back home, I opened my laptop again and compiled everything. Dates, electricity records, forged signatures, Carl's statement, the footage. All catalogued in a spreadsheet like a mission log. Names, events, timestamps. I wasn't just making a case, I was building a story, one they didn't expect to have a narrator. That evening, Mara called. You sent me a video, she said. I watched it. Good. Eleanor, this isn't just personal. If what we're seeing is true, they committed wire fraud, estate fraud, maybe more. I'm not here to punish, I said. I'm here to undo the erasure. There was a pause. I think we need to move up the injunction. They'll try to move the house again, liquidate it before we can make noise. They already did too much, I said. Now they're going to learn what happens when you bet against someone who's kept classified files alive in worse conditions. She laughed soft. Welcome back, soldier. I didn't laugh. I just said they should have checked what else was in the box. I sat with the footage one last time that night, paused it on the frame where Grandpa looked straight into the camera. There was no doubt in his eyes, just quiet certainty. They'll say I'm making it up, I whispered. But you knew. You always knew. I closed the lid, tucked the drive into a hollowed-out book and slid it back into my locker. This wasn't vengeance. This was recovery. This was resurrection, and tomorrow we'd begin. I sent Isaac a secure message at 7:03 a.m., simply, ready. Watch for invoices. He answered 3 minutes later, on it. Isaac was the one I trusted with classified network defences during joint task forces, someone who still respected protocol even when we were off the books. I grabbed my coffee and opened a file I'd set aside my government clearance history. Retired as of last week, but still listed as active in several internal systems. That discrepancy bothered me more than I expected. Around noon, Isaac called. His voice had a clipped edge I recognised from deployments. Eleanor, I'm pulling up daily invoicing for Helicore contractors, what the company billed federal clients for IT services. He paused. 2 contracts in the past 6 months. Combined, they're worth 6 figures. Those contracts are under your name and federal network credentials. My stomach seized. That's impossible. I wasn't involved, I know, he said, but someone used your DD-214 and your CAC credentials, the ones they digitally access, for O'Connor's to authenticate sensitive contracts. It's high-level clearance. Your name, Eleanor Marsh, is listed as prime contractor. I sat forward. That's fraud on a federal level. Exactly, Isaac said. They used your identity, your service credentials to get government money. That's beyond estate fraud. That's federal fraud. I thought back to the words I whispered to myself in the darkness of the car. They chose the wrong person to erase. Now, they'd weaponized me again. That afternoon, Mara met me at the law office. The blinds were drawn even though it was early. She didn't look at me, just slid across a folder labelled Contract Trail. Take a seat, she said. I sat. She opened the folder. Here's Isaac's report. Bank transfers, contract approvals, digital signatures. You signed them with your credential, but not your hand. I leaned in. So these go. To Helicore, yes. IT consulting contracts. For, of all things, cybersecurity assessments tied to logistics systems in the Middle East. That screams Connor's deal flow. She tapped photos of wire transfers, wired into accounts controlled by Sophie Marsh and Victor Marsh. They'd woven a web that tied them directly into government revenue through me. I felt cold anger. They don't just want the house, I said. They want to fund it with my name, my clearance. They risk penal charges and federal charges. Mara nodded. If we can prove it, we have criminal statutes on our side. We add wire fraud, identity theft, contract fraud. She looked at me flat. You understand the exposure I swallowed. I did. It meant testifying under oath, facing federal investigators, possibly reporters. but it also meant taking their skeletons out into harsh light. Sophie had already begun whisper campaigns in the town. I saw the posts, online half-truths and rumours about breakdowns, about PTSD, about me being unstable because I couldn't cope with civilian life. They were preparing public opinion to dismiss me before I got to court. Mara said public framing is critical. If they portray you as unhinged, the judge may doubt everything. I nodded slowly. Then, we frame it the other way. I'm not a victim. I'm documentation. She raised an eyebrow. You, again, show them what a veteran looks like. Methodical, disciplined, precise. Not a broken soldier. Her lips twitched into what passed for a small smile. You always were. I kept my gaze firm. I need Isaac to trace the contractor IDs back to the executives. Then we subpoena financials. Then we present evidence in court. We should also prepare a public statement. I'll draft one. Say it yourself, or let me read it, I'll say it. But you write it. Mara tapped the folder. Okay, we move next week. Injunction, asset freeze, DOJ referral. I nodded again. Inside, adrenaline swelled and settled like seawater in a reservoir. Calm but powerful. I had a mission, a timeline, a purpose. Later that night, I reviewed Isaac's emails. As I scrolled, another thought emerged. They'd used me as a shell, but they'd also banked on the idea I'd be too emotionally broken to fight. They thought grief would keep me silent. Too bad they didn't ask me about maps, about firewalls, about lines of code. Sleeping in combat zones taught me patience. Silent nights taught me presence. They wanted me erased. Instead, I'd rewrite their plays one evidence bite at a time. I closed the laptop around 11 p.m. There was a strange comfort in knowing they couldn't erase the digital breadcrumbs. They couldn't delete recorded timestamps or alter logs once subpoenaed. The system was more rigid than any personal vendetta. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, Grandpa me and the lemon tree. Below it, Eleanor's letter draft printed and laminated. I whispered, "They forgot who handles chaos." I set both in the shredder tray folder, email printouts. Not to destroy. To keep the space clear because there was more to come. Records to pull, experts to interview, cameras to install. Alison Jones, the forensic accountant Mara recommended. Isaac lining up subpoenas. In bed, I slept like the uniform never left my shoulders upright, tense with purpose. Tomorrow, the first legal move. Not for revenge. For existence. I woke before dawn, the early light matching the determination in my chest. I slipped into the dress uniform, white shirt, green trousers, ribbons still pressed in a perfect row. Retired, but still recognisable. The weight of it reminded me who I was and why I fought. Mara picked me up at 6:30 a.m. in her black sedan. She didn't comment on the uniform as I climbed in. She had the court packet already spread on the seat beside her. We drove in silence through the near-empty streets, lights still on in old coffee shops, before turning onto Mayfield Lane. I sat in the car as Mara went up to the front porch with a county bailiff and 2 sheriff's deputies. After a few minutes, she nodded. I stepped out the door, clicking behind me, and the early light revealed the crisp court order in her hands. She held it steady as they affixed it to the front door and left side window. The header read in bold type, "Temporary asset, freeze order, Hallencourt Properties, 721 Mayfield Lane, party Elena Marsh." My name on paper, my name in law, my name visible and unignorable. Connor and Sophie emerged slowly. Connor in jeans and a button-down purposeful silence about him. Sophie wore yesterday's yoga pants and a pale expression rubbing her thumb against the Velcro edge of the document. She read the words, then looked up at me. Her face was blank with shock. No voice came out, just the tight arch of her eyebrows. I kept my gaze fixed on her for several seconds, no anger, just clarity. "Eleanor, I didn't come to ask. I came so they can't keep writing me out." I said it softly, but there was no hiding in the morning air. They didn't answer. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, and Connor glanced at Mara, who stood quietly beside me. On the porch, the bailiff nodded to Mara. She motioned to me. I turned and walked away, with Mara trailing right behind me. I left the family behind in that moment. I kept my face calm, but my heart slowed so it could flow evenly. I didn't want another bounce of false pride. I only wanted that moment to be recorded in their memories as the moment their plan met resistance. People standing across the street stepped out to look, an older man with a dog, a neighbour at her fence. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. It wasn't them I was speaking to. It was the silence, the erasure, the attempt to make me a ghost. And today I showed them the receipts. Back in the car, Mara sat across from me. "You saw her?" she asked quietly. "Nodded," I replied. "Good," she said. "It's enough." The rest of that morning passed in blurred action interviews, phone calls to local news that were already swirling online press releases prepped. I sat through them at a table in Mara's office, eating 2 salty potato chips and balancing my coffee on a stack of legal pads. By noon, the sheriff had taped copies of the order on the mailbox and driveway entrance. Someone from the county courthouse called to confirm with Sophie and Connor that the order was in place. They asked if I wanted an official copy sent to me personally. I did. At 2 p.m, I was back at the house, but far enough down the block that I could observe without intruding. Sophie was pacing on the porch. Connor stood behind her, arms crossed. Mara stood with me on the sidewalk. I'd thought about marching up, slamming the door and declaring victory, but I didn't do that. Instead, I crouched so my uniform badge glinted in the corner of the window, a quiet reminder of who I was. A neighbour across the street walked over and asked softly, "Everything okay?" I looked over at him. "Family dispute," I said, "but it's being handled." He nodded like that made sense, probably thought I was the one in the right. When the neighbour left, Mara said, "Ready for the hearing notices this afternoon?" I nodded. Yes. She handed me 2 letters on official letterhead dates, times, instructions. The hearing would be in 14 days, before a judge I'd never met. I kept them safe in my coat pocket. At dusk, as we walked away for the last time that day, I turned to Mara. "I want to thank you." She tipped her head briefly. "You did this?" I nodded. Without protocol, this would have been just noise. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. We drove home with the engine humming. The street lamps along the road flickered as we passed familiar landmarks in a night that still had more darkness to offer. When I got back to the apartment, I removed my uniform and draped it over the chair folded neatly. I opened the file lining and laid the court notice on top. The order looked small there, but it said so much. I sat and watched it for a long time. A silent testament. In that moment, I realized it wasn't about reclaiming a building. It was about reclaiming presence, reclaiming identity. In front of that door, I reclaimed my name. I closed the file and sent a message to Isaac. They froze it. His response came quickly. Next DOJ subpoenas, contracts. I stared at the ceiling, thinking of how I'd come home to silence, and now I was returning it. Tomorrow, the trial. The courtroom doors swung open at 9 a.m. The hall smelled of old mahogany and polished leather. My fingers traced the edge of the bench before I sat. I wore civilian clothes, dark pants, crisp blouse, but inside I was as prepared as I'd ever been. Mara was beside me, laptop humming quietly. Isaac was behind us, reviewing notes. Carl stood near the back, arms crossed, grim but resolute. When the judge entered, a hush fell sharper than any click of a camera shutter. I stood, then sat. Hearts pounded. I felt Sophie's eyes on me piercing, but I didn't look back. Mara began with opening statements that held weight without theatrics, forged documents, manipulated contracts, theft of inheritance, misuse of federal identity. She laid out a map of crime, not to vilify family, but to track erasure and exposure. Then, when it was my turn, I stood and approached the box. I held a folder, my evidence record. My voice was low, even. "I'm Eleanor Marsh," I said. "I served 22 years for my country." I watched the judge watch me ribbons of past service, invisible but present. When I came home, I discovered my name stolen, my identity used for profit, my inheritance taken. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to correct the record. Silence settled thick like unbroken glass. Then I said it. They didn't just try to delete me. They tried to replace truth. The words landed soft but definitive. Mara called Isaac to the stand. He identified data logs showing my CSE-based access codes used thousands of miles from where I'd been deployed. Each digital signature matched mine, except it wasn't me at the keyboard. He showed IP addresses linked to the Marsh property that matched Halcor digital traffic. The room's air tasted colder. Sophie blinked as though she'd forgotten her own eyes could do that. Next, the video expert. On screen, he played metadata analysis of the grandfather video. He confirmed the date stamp, the location match, and the hash, the digital fingerprint that tied the recording file to my grandfather's study. "The video is unaltered," he said. "No evidence of editing or tampering." The judge nodded, noting the significance. Then Mara called Carl Rivers. He took the stand, voice low. "I've known Eleanor's grandfather all my life. I've serviced cars here for 20 years. He described Connor bringing in unmarked boxes at midnight. He said he heard Sophie whisper, 'She's unstable. We can't have her complicating this.'" He met Sophie's gaze and then looked away. Sophie's hands trembled as she held tissues. Victor's seat was empty. He'd opted out of testifying. Silence spoke louder. I met Sophie's eyes one more time. No accusation, just the clarity of truth on display. Mara closed her evidence. Forged signatures on your property deeds, electricity bills from an industrial freezer circuit in the basement wire transfer records, screenshots from emailing contracts under my name bills to government agencies, and even a log of rental payments to Halcor accounts. She laid them out like pieces in a puzzle. The judge examined each sheet. When it was my turn again, I didn't repeat data points. Instead, I shared how it felt the moment I stepped off that cab uniform, pressed to a locked door, and a silent porch. I recalled the flicker in Grandpa's light, the anonymous text, the crooked for sale sign. I spoke of calling my mother's grave silence healing me. I told them of unravelling patterns that 6-figure contracts in my name were bought with deceit. I trusted loyalty, I said. You broke that, but I'll still hold it to truth. Mara wrapped things up. She argued not only inheritance, but federal-level fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, misuse of government credentials. Your Honour, she said softly, this is a crime of erasure and exploitation. It's not sibling rivalry, it is a deliberate conspiracy. Intent meets opportunity, and here we have proof. My lawyer closed her binder and stepped away. The judge stared at the exhibits, the transcript, the DVD sits that glowed with my grandfather's voice. Sophie swallowed hard, her face pale. Connor sat stiff as steel. Victor looked away, posture rigid. In the waiting silence, I realized this wasn't vengeance. This was justice by method. Quiet, precise, irrefutable, not for applause, but for presence. Later that day, I walked back through the court halls. Reporters waved microphones. Someone asked for a statement. I paused, then said calmly, I'm here to reclaim what they tried to erase. Not with noise, but with evidence. No flash, no flourish, just a fact. As I returned home, I thought again of Grandpa's silent study, of my mother's half-sentence of the utility spikes and digital signatures. Piece by piece, I dismantled their plan. The judge hadn't ruled yet. But I didn't need a gavel to know something had shifted. The weight of evidence, the silence that followed, it all pointed in one direction. They'd spent years rewriting me out. Now, The story was finally correcting itself. The courtroom reconvened the next morning with an air of quiet intensity. As Mara's closing argument ended, she gave me a slight nod. It was time for one final piece. I rose again, feeling calmer than I'd ever been. I walked to the front, lonelier this time, no video screen, no expert testimony. Just me, the judge, and one envelope. The courtroom watched. Sophie's face was pale, Connor's posture stiff. Victor's eyes stayed downcast. I cleared my throat. Your Honour, I would like to present a document that was forgotten or perhaps overlooked. The judge gave me a terse nod. I handed the envelope to Mara first, then to the court clerk, who carefully unsealed it and placed it on the evidence table. Inside a single sheet of paper, the edges creased, bearing my mother's handwriting. Mara introduced it as a notarized letter from Margaret Marsh, dated the day after my grandfather's funeral. The clerk read the date aloud 6 months before the fraudulent property transfer. The room hushed. I requested the letter for reading. I unfolded it and began voice steady, Eleanor, my brave, strong daughter. If you are reading this, it means your grandfather's wishes are contested. I want you to know that he always intended this house for you. Not because you were born first, but because you loved this place with more of your heart than anyone. Don't let them define you. You know who you are. I paused. Their eyes flickered between me and the letter. I folded it back. This is my mother's voice, I said. It confirms what he said on camera. It confirms what was forgotten by the people who tried to rewrite our history. It's a final affirmation I belong. The judge leaned forward, studying the document. The silence stretched, compressing every sound, a distant cough, the soft rustle of paper. It wasn't shock, it was recognition. Quiet recognition of undeniable truth. Mara didn't say a word. She simply sat back, hands folded. I lowered my gaze briefly, then met the judge's eyes. The weight of her attention was heavy but respectful. In that moment, I felt something shift in the room. Legal momentum tilted. Rewrites were losing. History was returning. When the clerk accepted the letter and marked it, I sat. I looked at Sophie. She glanced down, her lips pressed. Connor's jaw clenched. Victor finally looked up, not at me, but at the judge. Their support had crumbled. The judge cleared his throat. We will recess and review all evidence in full, she said evenly. This letter will be included in the record. She looked at me. Counsel, thank you. She turned to Mara. Ms. Lynn, you may rise. Then she looked at Sophie and Connor. You may step down as needed. No applause, no murmur of dissension, just the crisp strike of the gavel, marking closure and potential new beginnings. I collected the letter from the clerk and slipped it back into my jacket. It felt warmer there, the ink still carrying my mother's voice. I passed Mara on my way back to the seat. Thank you, I whispered. She nodded, a tight smile touching her lips. Outside, the courthouse reporters flocked. I didn't stop to speak. I just walked to my car letter, secure in my coat pocket, evidence set name intact and a quiet certainty that the truth would this time outlast their erasures. The courtroom reconvened 2 days later for the verdict. The morning light was sharp, casting defined shadows through the tall windows. I sat in the front row, Mara beside me, Isaac and Carl, behind silent pillars of shared purpose. Sophie and Connor entered, flanked by Victor, their faces subdued, tense. No one spoke. The judge took her seat and adjusted her glasses. I felt the tension ease, not because I feared anything, but because I'd seen every piece of this puzzle come together. I met Mara's gaze. She nodded once. After careful review of all testimony exhibits and supporting documentation, the judge said, "Voice steady, this court finds. As follows, Eleanor Marsh is the legitimate heir to the property located at 721 Mayfield Lane. All documents indicating otherwise are declared null and void." A hush spread, then a breath exhaled. No applause, just the soft scrape of feet and the rustle of clothing as the words sank in. The judge continued. Furthermore, compelling evidence indicates that Connor Hale engaged in federal contract fraud, identity theft, and misuse of government credentials. An arrest warrant is to be issued immediately upon adjournment. Connor's face drained. Sophie reached for him, but he stood rigid. Victor's head bowed. I didn't look at them. I watched the judge speak next. Sophie Marsh and Victor Marsh are hereby ordered to appear for further proceedings related to charges of conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. Proceedings in that matter will occur in civil and criminal court. This court retains jurisdiction. The gavel came down. A single crisp sound. I let it settle inside me. That moment I stood. Not to celebrate, to honour. My uniform was gone, but an invisible badge remained of dignity, of resolution. A courtroom attendant nodded toward the clerk who gestured for me to approach. I leaned forward. Your Honour, I would like to make a statement. The judge inclined her head. I caught Mara's breath, saw Isaac brace himself, and a single tear roll from Carl's eye. I didn't win a house today, I said. My voice echoed across rows. I reclaimed something that can't be sold, something more powerful than land or walls. I reclaimed my name, my identity, and the record now matches the woman I've always been. The judge nodded. I turned briefly to Sophie. Her eyes cast down, then to Connor, and last to Victor, who didn't look up. I returned to my seat. Mara offered a small smile. Visitors in the gallery began to stir. Outside, reporters waited. Flashbulbs popped. I paused on the courthouse steps letter, folded in my palm. A veteran in faded camouflage jacket approached me and said quietly, Knight Marsh. I nodded and he saluted. No words needed. At the side, I saw Mara talking with police officers as they escorted Connor away. He did not look back. Sophie stayed beside Victor. I didn't approach them. They'd had their chance to speak. Now, I walked past them, head held. A group of veterans surrounded me, silent nods, firm handshakes. One middle-aged woman with a purple heart pin said, Welcome home, Ma'am. I nodded back. I thought about the notice on the porch that had blocked me, the crooked for sale sign, the locked gate, the anonymous messages, the shadows in the basement. I thought of every step that led me here. The judge followed me outside, offering a curt, Congratulations, Ms. Marsh? I nodded. She turned away, her robe sweeping. Her job was done. The veterans began to file past. I slipped the letter into my jacket. It felt warm, as if those ghost voices were still alive with me. I stepped toward my car, then paused. I looked back at the courthouse. A symbol not of war, but of homecoming justice. Inside the car, I exhaled slowly. I turned the key and the engine started a subtle but firm hum. I pulled away and drove past Mayfield Lane. The house was still there, quiet, solid, untouchable. The porch light blinked twice. The gate swung slightly in the morning breeze. No sign had been reattached yet. Perhaps it would need a new nameplate. I didn't need to see it right now. I'd left a letter with the judge, a copy with Mara, and another in a safe deposit box. My voice was recorded, notarized, authenticated. My name was on every page. I drove until I reached the edge of town, past the ball field and the old cafe. The streetlights flickered off one by one as day fully arrived. I parked under the old oak tree still standing. Its bark scarred, initials faded. I stepped out, fingers brushing the trunk. I whispered under my breath, Eleanor Marsh. No one else needed to hear it. I felt centered. That evening at home, I opened my journal and wrote, Today, I reclaimed more than property. I reclaimed presence. I don't know what happens next in civil court, but whatever it is, I'll face it the same way, clear-eyed, disciplined, a woman who refused to disappear. When morning came, I didn't reach for my uniform. I grabbed a hammer, a small wood carving set, and a weathered plaque I'd had made by a local craftsman. 3 names elegantly etched Eleanor Marsh. Eugene Marsh and Eleanor Marsh. My grandparents and me. A lineage, a reminder. I pulled into the driveway at 721 Mayfield Lane, weekend sunrise, soft against the siding. The notice from court was still taped to the door, but the house had a different air now, not hostile, just familiar. I stepped onto the porch, tools in hand, and placed the plaque on the gate where my grandfather's carving once sat. The board was empty now, the name worn away. It centered itself with gentle weight in my palms, and I felt the lineage press forward, coming back. I tapped the plaque into place, the hammer's first tap, soft and final. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. My heart caught at the echo in the quiet morning. I looked at the gate and traced the letters Eleanor, Eugene, Elena. I touched the smooth letters, the grooves my fingers remembered from childhood, when I used to run them across my grandparents' worn handwriting on letters and diaries. A light breeze carried the scent of lilacs. I turned and saw a little girl, 6 or 7, standing across the street. She watched me with wide curiosity. She held a small bunch of daisies she'd plucked from her own front yard. She stepped closer, shy but steady. I wiped my hands on my jeans and crouched. She held out the daisies and asked quietly, "Are you the one who planted those flowers?" I followed her gaze to a small patch beneath the gate. Fresh yellow daisy seedlings neatly planted their petals bright against the green leaves. I realised I must have sowed them during my drive in out of habit, the same ones I used to plant by the kitchen window, as a girl under Grandma's supervision. "I did," I answered. "They'll grow strong, just like this place." She smiled and nodded, then itsy hands grabbed her flowers in a polite offering. I accepted them, placing them gently in a corner pot on the porch. She turned and skipped back up the sidewalk without another word. I listened to her retreating footsteps, tiny, hopeful. I examined the plaque again. A quiet warmth spread through me. I hadn't reclaimed a building. I'd reclaimed something deeper, history, belonging, and a piece of myself that had been nearly erased by ambition and betrayal. Behind me, I heard a door click open, and Mara stepped out, a law partner now, and friend forever. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes soft. "It's beautiful," she said. I nodded. "It belongs here. And there." I pointed to the plaque, then to my heart. She stepped closer. Together, we looked at the daisies swaying in the breeze. The house still had cages of shadows behind curving vines, but the gate held truth now. "It's time," she said quietly. "Time to move forward." I looked at the house, the plaque, the little flowers, and thought, this place isn't mine to live in yet, but it is mine to name, and mine to remember. I stood and reached into my pocket, pulling out the handwritten letter from my mother, its edges soft with age. I placed it gently at the base of the plaque under the daisies, as a silent tribute, a foundation of affirmation beneath new roots. Then I stepped off the porch, Mara beside me, and walked down the pathway. The morning light stretched across the yard, brushing the board and flowers with soft promise. A neighbour across the street stepped out onto her porch, waved. I waved back. No flash, no headline, just shared acknowledgement. I felt something settle, a circle completed. Not triumphant, not celebrated, just enough. Before I left, I reached back and traced my name on the plaque. One last time, Eleanor, and whispered, I didn't come back for property. I came back for the right to be remembered. Maybe that's what so many of us want. Not a house, not revenge, not even justice with a capital J. Just to be seen. Just to know that our story didn't end when someone else stopped telling it. If you're someone who's been written out, pushed aside, made to feel like your truth didn't matter, know this, you're not alone. There are people sitting in cars right now just like I did that night. People staring at old homes, old photos, old messages, wondering if they'll ever get the chance to reclaim something they lost. Not all of us get courtrooms. Not all of us get letters left behind. But we can all start somewhere, with a friend who listens, a journal entry, no one erases a quiet step toward remembering who we are before the world tried to convince us otherwise. Healing doesn't always come with headlines. Sometimes it starts with writing your name down, saying it out loud, reminding yourself you still exist, that you matter. If this story found you, stayed with you, or reminded you of your own quiet strength, I'd love for you to stay connected. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. We build this space together, one voice at a time.